I'm honored to be here, and I really like to say this. I love these exposed beams, but is it kind of like a bad seat at a stadium where you have the thing? Anyway, I look at you all and I say, I used to be you, and I actually never had the kind of training that you had. I went to a small private liberal arts school back in the, I won't say few decades ago, and we had one journalism course. And I was a government major. I was going to go to law school, but while I was waiting to find out if I got in, there was this part-time job open at a local TV station, and I just thought, well, that'll be fun while I wait. And now 40 few years later, it's been my career the whole time, and everything I've learned on the job. And that's still, the stuff you're learning here is really valuable, because if you can come in with this kind of knowledge, you're a step above people like me when I started. But the key thing is, we do train people, so when we eventually hopefully hire all of you, no matter what kind of position it is, we do train people. So, you don't have to feel like you need to know everything to have this career or to start this career. And you can ask me questions about that later if you're interested, but we now have paid internships too. We have 4 a year, so it's a little bit, competitive, but Gray decided to do that because we seriously look to hire interns. If they end up being good, we make them a full-time job offer after. It's basically a recruitment pipeline. So, I think it pays, $10, $11 an hour, but it pays, and it used to not pay, so that was good. And Gray also, as a company, developed a minimum wage for entry-level positions. In broadcasting, typically because there's a lot of interest in these jobs, that the industry could kind of get away with paying as much as they could, but not too much. They would always try to keep the cost low because they knew someone would take that job at whatever the salary. So Gray decided, we really need to open this up and to really encourage people to take these jobs. So they created an $18 an hour minimum wage. Now, most people are making even a little more than that, but that's like the minimum for like someone that is just coming right out of school that maybe hasn't even had the kind of training you guys have. So Gray takes recruitment and retention and benefits really seriously. Also, last year they started a employee-free healthcare program. So in other words, if you're an employee, you don't have to pay anything for your healthcare. If you had a family or a spouse, then that's different. You'd have to add them on. But the individual employee is free. And that's huge for people like you because you're just starting out. Having an extra couple $100 pay period in your check is important, So I really like Gray Television as a company because they're people like us, like people in the industry, people like Lee Brantley, people that have done these jobs, in management and in news and other areas, sales and so forth. And there's so many different career possibilities. So we could even talk about that some other time later. But I just wanted to share that with you. So that's the company that I work for, and I really do recommend them when you are doing your job hunting. So when I talked to Marion, we talked about ethics, and I always think that people these days, a lot of people like to say, oh, fake news, this and that. That's kind of a tired thing a little bit. But there's still this feeling like, how do we know a story's true? And I think people that watch the news have a right to ask that question and hopefully have it answered by what they see. But it's not as easy as just like reporting the facts or a fact. So I thought we'd kind of go through what makes a news story true, because the role of ethics, confirmation, and dignity have a lot to do with that process. So what makes a news story true? Consider the source is a very important thing, and by that I mean there's context around everything. So know who the source is. Know if the source has a political affinity that maybe they haven't acknowledged publicly, but maybe you know it, or someone tells you that. You can ask them about that. Consider the source means look at your source and understand who that person is. And there's never just one source for a news story. So that's important to remember too. always be skeptical. Like, I used to think I'm fairly gullible and so forth, and I was a reporter, so that was kind of dangerous, right? Being naive and gullible. But I was always kind of skeptical, and I think skeptical doesn't have to mean like you doubt everything, but it means that you're curious. Like, what's going on? Like, what is the story really about? Is it as simple as it looks? And then, of course, don't just follow the crowd. It's really easy to get caught up in some reporting, and we'll show this in a minute, where you're not really thinking for yourself. You're thinking, oh, this is what I should do because that's what everyone else is doing. So you really have to really try to ignore that feeling. Because there can be more than one truth in a story. There are differing points of view. Each of those points of view are valid. So there's not necessarily, when you're reporting, and I'm talking about news, not opinion, which we'll talk about in a second, but there's different viewpoints on the same story. And when you're under deadline, a lot of people think, well, I've got this part of it, and that kind of tells the story. I got to get this on the air. I'm done. Well, again, don't be lazy and don't think that just one person's going to be able to tell the whole story for you in your presentation. And then again, push to confirm, not conform, is kind of the same topic, meaning ask people to confirm something, make sure it's real. Don't just say, well, everyone else is saying this, so I guess I can say it because everyone else has already said it. Maybe, but it's always best to confirm facts with people and not try to follow the crowd, essentially. I've got some examples. I think we can all learn from major reporting mistakes, and the most recent one that everyone's heard about is the Gaza hospital attack. And initially, everyone was reporting that Israel struck a hospital and killed 500 people. And so that was widely accepted right at the start. So I thought we would play this, and I'll show you what they reported.
Right now in Gaza, the Palestinian Health Ministry says as many as 300 people were killed after a strike on a hospital in central Gaza. They go on to say there were as many as 500 victims in all. The Israeli military says it is investigating just what happened.
At this hour, the critical Rafah border crossing in southern Gaza on the border with Egypt also remains closed.
So that was the original story. And there kind of was a rush to judgment on that story where even when people started saying, are we sure this is true? People were kind of holding the line. And so there was, in a way, what I think of as a rush to judgment. And there was coverage like this.
The Israeli Prime Minister today said, and I quote, the intelligence from multiple sources said that it's the Islamic Jihad is responsible for the failed rocket launch.
He is a liar. His spokesperson and digital spokesperson tweeted that Israel did the hit, thinking that there is around this hospital a base for Hamas, and then he deleted that tweet. We have a copy of that tweet, and Talal can share with you that tweet. Now they change the story to try to blame the Palestinians. It is a lie, and the Israeli spokesperson of the army, about a week ago, made a statement in which he said, evacuate the hospitals are target, and in fact they hit one hospital out.
So that's how the story started developing, with a lot of people saying that this was true, that Israel did bomb the hospital, when in fact it was later discovered, and pretty quickly discovered actually in the cycle of news. It was a day or two later, but a lot of news entities were very slow to correct this story. But when they did, this was the correction. Oh, is there no audio on this one? Might not be. This was the footage that was released showing the failed rocket going up, and they had some arrows and so forth. So anyway, that's what happened when they actually proved that it wasn't the Israelis that hit the hospital, and the Islamic Jihad had fired a missile that misfired essentially, blew up and parts of it fell into the hospital parking lot, which was quite a different story than 500 people killed as it was reported in the original attack. So I think that's an important thing to remember is, don't take everything at face value. When you watch the news, even our news, be skeptical. Does that ring true? Does that, make sense? And then later, if it was wrong, did we address it? Which is a really important thing. Whoops, sorry.
Major development breaking right now in Gaza.
They said, and I quote, intelligence from multiple sources said that it's...
Sorry. So, let's see. There we go. Okay, so it's really important to ask in a story, what's missing? And that's something that good journalists do, that ethical journalists do. What's missing? So I thought this was instructive. I found this on the internet in some of the reporting, and this is from an independent journalist named David Zweig. And so he found that this 500 people were killed story was repeated in countless stories attributed to the Gaza Health Ministry. And then I bolded this: the result of Western journalists misquoting a statement cited by Al Jazeera saying that 500 people were victims without ever verifying the claim. And then he said he contacted dozens of reporters, and not one reporter replied to his inquiries, which is irresponsible in my opinion. And so none of them would respond with the source behind what they'd written. So that just adds to the miscommunication and the misunderstanding of stories when journalists are not able to, or when people that are supposed to cooperate with them are not telling them the truth, or they're repeating a party line. So this is where you have to kind of ask more questions. And the fact that no reporter from those outlets actually answered his question was an answer, in a way, to his question. So that's an important thing to consider. So what can we do differently? Obviously, I said this before, but seek a variety of views. And there's always a different way to approach a story than maybe the most linear way. So in other words, I don't know, whatever story you're working on, it might be obvious to talk to this one person, and then maybe another person kind of who has a similar experience that can back up what that first person said. But who else should you talk to? Maybe there's someone with a totally divergent point of view. That could really help your story be more complete and more in context. It's so important to be right before being first. And we can talk more about that later if you have any questions about that. But, especially in the digital age, there's so much information that's put out there. And there's this real race among a lot of digital and news entities to be first. But being first, it's great if you're right. But if you're not right, it creates all sorts of problems. And it's much, much better to be right than to be first. People do not always remember who is right, but they always remember who is wrong. So you don't want to be that. So that's an important thing to consider. And then I think it's really important to own your mistakes and literally apologize. Nothing is more ethical than doing that. And a lot of people are afraid to do that because they think it makes them look bad. But it does not. And so corrections, really ethical corrections, should be swift and humble and straight to the point. And I just picked this one out of the New York Times. They do publish corrections. And so this one, to me, it's a little bit funny because it's about celebrities and how they misidentified Lizzo or saying someone was Missy Elliott, but it was Lizzo. And then it says it also misspelled the given name of an actress shown in another photo, Courtney Cox, not Courtney, spelled a different way. So, but that's what they'll do. They will correct facts if facts are wrong, and that's the right thing to do. Now, one thing I'll say about corrections is when someone's arrested for a crime, pretty much any crime, and I had an example of this the other day. We had done a story a long time ago on someone who was arrested at a traffic stop for drugs. Well, turns out he was a passenger. He was never charged after he was initially arrested. They dropped all the charges, but our story was on the internet. And every time he applied for a job, up came the story about this poor guy, arrested for drugs when he didn't do anything wrong. So he asked us, would we take the story down, take it off of our website so it would not appear in any internet searches. And we checked it out, and then we very quickly did that and told him we did that, because it's unfair to stigmatize someone for the rest of their lives for something that wasn't even true. And we never really report on someone who's charged with something and then they drop the charges, unless it's a really big case. It just kind of fades away. But it's really important that we acknowledge that we should do that when we know those answers, and it really does matter on an ethical level, I think, to me. So I think it's really important to own your mistakes. Editing video to back up a narrative, because a lot of things are written, but video's what we trade in, obviously, video on digital platforms or on TV. So video becomes very, very important. And you can very much endorse or refute a statement by the way the video is edited. And I know you guys are a lot younger than me, but I think you might remember the Trayvon Martin case, where a young man was walking around an apartment complex, and a guy called the police because he thought he looked shady. And so this is an interesting piece about what NBC did when they were editing this story.
This guy looks like he's up to no good. He looks black. Did you see him black? Yeah, I'm dark hoodie. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or on drugs or something. It's raining, and he's just walking around looking down. Okay, this guy, you went by first time? He looks black. Did you see him black? Yeah, I'm dark hoodie, like gray hoodie, and
So NBC had to apologize because, if you noticed, they had changed the words by editing out where the police ask if he knows if he's white or black. The original edit made it look like the guy was targeting Trayvon because he was black. Now, the facts of the case aside and all that, I just wanted to bring this particular issue in front of you so that you can see that major networks will do things occasionally. And of course, NBC is very well known for creating false videos of trucks exploding back in a Dateline expose on how dangerous trucks were, and they had to call that back. They completely set up the whole thing. So it's amazing what some news entities will do to either make a point or to look good or some other agenda that they may have. But editing video is really important that is done ethically as well. Whoops, oh, darn it, did that again, sorry. So I think really ethics require reporters to keep a couple things in mind. Respect, dignity, and integrity. And those are big words, and everyone uses those words. What do they really mean? But it's really not hard to practice this in everyday life when you're a reporter or when you're writing something that has to be factual. It's important that when you're interviewing news subjects, people that might be victims of a robbery or victims of a house fire or something, these people, they're real people. They have emotions. And we, as the media, in quotes, should never act like, well, you have to talk to me because I need to do a story on this. They have emotions. They're not robots. They're very important people in the telling of the story, and you have to respect them, and you have to encourage them to share the story for the right reasons, which is that we want their viewpoint. And when you can successfully communicate that to people, almost always they'll say yes, they will talk to you. Sometimes they don't want their face shown. Okay, we can shoot around that. Sometimes they don't want their voice shown or heard. That's fine, we can work around that. That's all about respecting the news subjects, because a lot of people, it's the whole cliche of, well, how, you're family was all killed in this fire. You know, how do you feel? You know, that's not right. That's not the right question to ask ever. And it's equally important to respect your viewers and readers. You want to respect their intelligence. You also want to respect them by explaining the story to them in a way that's easy to understand, because when we assign a reporter to a story, they pretty much have the whole day to work on that story. So they know the ins and outs of it, maybe, hopefully, to the point where they could just tell you, like I'm standing here, they could tell you what happened. Well, that's great, but the viewer at home only has a minute and a half to understand what the heck happened with that story. So we have to be really, really clear. We have to respect the viewers and understand that, you know, they don't live this all day. So that's why we have to be really clear about what are we saying, what does it mean, what's the conclusion, and tell it in a way that they can really, you know, understand it. And then this is kind of basic, but you earn respect by your actions. So if you decide to take any shortcuts, next time someone might remember that and maybe they won't respect you enough to give you an interview. You have to show by your everyday actions that you're someone that's worthy of trust. That's a really important thing, I think, when it comes to you know, ethical reporting. And there is a code, actually, the Society of Professional Journalists Code. And I highlighted, this isn't all of it, but this is kind of the you know, just the high level stuff, that they're acknowledging that public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and democracy, and that ethical journalism has to have these attributes. It has to be a free exchange of information, which is what we talked about with getting a lot of different, you know, people involved and making sure you're telling all sides of it. It must be accurate, fair, and thorough. Meaning, if there's a part of the story, the thorough part is really important, because it's easy to, again, take shortcuts and say, well, this happened, and then, you know, that's the end of it. When there might be something else that will give context to the story. Like maybe the next time the person's in court, or the next time someone's going to look at this story because it's an ongoing situation. That's what it means to be thorough. And of course, an ethical journalist acts with integrity, which we just talked about. So that's the code. There's a lot more to it if you look it up online. It's kind of interesting. So this is my last slide for you all. I think it is. Yes, it is. How can you ensure a news story is true? Well, I just put this little checklist here. And this is really what we think about every day when we go through the news. It must be sourced, balanced, and fair. All facts must be reported and not twisted. Opinion is not fact and should be labeled as such. So when something's an opinion or an editorial, it needs to be labeled that way to distinguish it from news. Just like if we ran a sponsored commercial segment in the news, which we really don't do, but if, let's say it's adjacent to the news, meaning it's next to a newscast, we always put sponsored by. That's so the viewer knows that that isn't us saying, you know, this is the best car or whatever. It's a paid announcement, so to speak. More voices in a story provide context, and it strengthens your content. The more people you can have in a story, and of course, the more diverse that is, the better. Because, you know, we want to see doctors of all kinds. We don't just want to see, you know, a white male doctor all the time. Even if they're a great source, we got to look for other people. We can't just do that all the time and have the same people. Always have a manager or editor review your story. Very, very important, because they can spot things. Again, kind of like a viewer might, if they're hearing it for the first time, they might have some questions. So wait, this doesn't make sense. Like you're telling me this here, but then later you're kind of contradicting it. You know, what does this mean? So a manager or editor has to review a story or a press release or anything, you know, before it goes public. Be open to criticism and collaboration. Collaboration is really what news and digital producing of any kind of, you know, really public relations, anything you would do is a collaboration with other people. None of us ever do it all alone. But if you make a mistake, admit it, apologize, learn from it. And I always like to say the best writing is rewriting. When you write something, take a look at it yourself and say, how could this be stronger? And there's almost always a way that it can be. So thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Yeah, Sydney.
So I know this has probably happened quite a few times in your career, possibly, but when you've published a story about an individual maybe committing a crime or something, is it common for someone, maybe a family member of that individual, call and say, well, this isn't true, you've got this wrong, even though you have your sources, you know it's true, but they're trying to make sure their name's not being smeared or anything like that. Does that happen a lot, or is that?
It doesn't happen a lot. I mean, it has happened where people say that just isn't true, but you have the police report, and you just kind of have to weigh that.
Right, and how do you deal with that?
Well, I think mostly you just kind of have to review it and maybe call the police back and say, hey, I just got a call from this guy's parents, and they say this isn't true. And that's a way to maybe, get someone to give you even a little more information, to make the story stronger. But it's a really good question. Every once in a while that happens, but it's not as common as you would think, in a way. Yes, Marion. Excuse me.
So I was watching the news the night that the story broke about the Maine shootings. When
Yeah.
I was still on the loose and all that.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I'm watching for hours.
Right.
And the next morning, at least the network that I was watching was walking everything back that they had initially reported.
Mhm.
Can you speak a little bit to to dissecting what happened? Because I'm assuming it was more than just the network that I was watching.
Yeah.
What happens in a situation like that?
That's such a hard situation to cover because it's changing so fast, and there's so many different, maybe there's Maine State Police, and then there's the local police, and then there's some other organization. I think the FBI was brought into that, I think, as well. So that's an interesting dynamic, because you do have sometimes the police entities kind of battling each other for supremacy, and they want to be the ones to say something. Remember when they were reporting that he was in his house, and they were all around the house saying, come out with your hands up. He wasn't in the house, and for a long time, it was reported that he's in the house, they're going to get him, that kind of thing. So yeah, those situations are actually a little more forgiving because they're happening live, and in real time, you can't always know the actual truth, But as soon as more information came out about him, I think that was good, because it sort of talked about how they knew he had mental problems and he had been in a psychiatric facility. And then just recently, right before the shooting, I guess his Army unit was calling the local cops saying, this guy, he's trouble. So, as more and more of that comes out, then that sort of starts to put things in context a little bit. And I think that helps as well. But those are really challenging things to report. Really, anything live, actual an event that's happening live is very difficult to cover. Yeah. Yes.
During the course of your career, have you noticed more government influence over what you're able to report, the sourcing of the data, or the exerted influence of some form?
Actually, no. In the local arena, it doesn't really happen that way. I think and recently, just I think today and yesterday, a story came out about the Cybersecurity Information Agency and what they did during the 2020 elections to work with some entities to suppress some conservative information. That's happening at, I think, a level pretty far above us locally. So, if it happens, if it did happen, we would just kind of, try to deal with it, talk to them, say, why are you inhibiting us, and that kind of thing. Sometimes with FOIA requests, Freedom of Information, we do get some pushback from different entities. That's probably the extent of it for us here locally. Luckily it's not too much of a problem locally. Any other questions? Hey,
Is
Joel.
there ever a time when you and your administrative side of your job here intervene in a story in any way, like whether it runs or some part of it runs or not, just because of the business side of the house?
I mean, I'm always saying, news is news and sales is sales. And there were a couple of instances that I can think of. Like one time, this is several years ago, but some employee who was soon to be a former employee of headquartered Nissan had kept credit card numbers for service, orders or something. So he had these numbers, and he was using those numbers to charge things for himself. That's essentially what was going on. And so when he was arrested, the police said, he worked at headquartered Nissan. So I made sure that we called headquartered Nissan to say, does this guy still work for you or not? They said, no, we fired him a while ago. So we told the story, but there's not necessarily a reason to tar headquartered Nissan just because the guy was a bad guy, right? We said he got a hold of customer credit cards from, I forget how we said it, but we told the story, but we didn't necessarily feel at that point that we had to drag them into it. Now, and it was a very short-term thing, but if that had been going on for like years, then we might have reconsidered. That's one thing I can think of. And then we usually I try to give, and I think Lee, you're probably the same way, clients a heads up if there's going to be a bad story about them, because there's going to be, for someone, a bad story, and we have to do it. There's just it's church and state. News and sales are separate. You have to have it that way. But I've given people heads up about stories. I've said, hey, we're doing this story, and just thought you should know. And sometimes I joke about this, but if there's a dead body in the McDonald's drive-thru, we're definitely going to report on the dead body, and we're going to say it's in the McDonald's drive-thru. Some people would say, oh, there's a dead body found in Columbus. No, that's not enough of the story. So I think you have to be careful with that, but every once in a while it comes up, but not as much as you'd think. And a lot of times we tell clients up front, especially if they're new, we'll say, if you have any events that your company's doing, let us know. If they're newsworthy, we might cover it. We never promise. But we also tell them at that time, if your company's involved in a legitimate news story, we will be telling that story. And most of them go, okay, yeah, we get it. So luckily, it's not too much of a problem.
And some don't.
Yeah, right, some don't. Some don't. Oh, some will pull advertise. They'll pull advertising. They'll be so mad. And I'll tell you a famous story that I dealt with here shortly after I got here and succeeded Lee in my job. Zaxby's was opening a new restaurant. I forget which one it was, but it was one during their expansion. It was about 7 years ago maybe. And so they do what's called a soft opening. And so they invite family and friends, and they have food for like 300 people, and they let everyone in. They're not open, but they let everyone in who's invited come and have a, Zaxby's sandwich. And that's great, that it's not open to the public. So we get a call in the newsroom, and a reporter answers the phone, and the person says, they're being racist at Zaxby's. They shut me out of Zaxby's, and everyone else is getting fed, and they shut the door on me, and I know it's because I'm black. So the reporter goes out there, interviews them, calls Zaxby's. Zaxby's says, essentially, we don't know what you're talking about at first, So unfortunately, this is why I put in the presentation, have a manager review your copy. Because what really was happening is that there was this soft opening that was not public, but had been put out on the internet, on social media. So a bunch of people who weren't invited, after the 300 who were, showed up expecting food and felt slighted because there was no more food left for them. And almost a total misunderstanding of what was going on. And yet we were reporting, because we aired the sound bites, people saying Zaxby's is racist. They shut the door in my face. I know it's because I'm black. Well, it sounded true. It sounded like, well, that sounds terrible. Like that could have happened. We can't have that, So the reporter, who's very inexperienced, didn't seek out, and we had a failure in the, we had a failure in the newsroom management. So that should never have happened. She never should have gone out alone to that story, and then furthermore came back, wrote the story, and no one looked at it, no one. And I remember I was busy that day, and I get a call from Zaxby's, and they're furious. And I listened to them, and at this point, I didn't even know that we had done this story. So I had to find out. And remember, we have a news director. I'm not the news director, I'm the general manager, so typically, I mean, I'm interested in what happens with the news, but I don't want to be the news director. That's what I did a long time ago when I was, developing my career. And I still help them, like I said, as much as I can, but that really wasn't my job that day, but everything's my responsibility. So we had to do some major damage, repair on that. And I fell on the sword, I don't know how many times, with the Zaxby's people saying, I apologize, it never should have happened. And we did do a story later, the next day, or pretty much the next day, saying we were wrong. This was a soft opening that had a limited amount of food. When the food was gone, they shut the doors, period. That's it, that's the story. We had Zaxby's statement. By then, they kind of figured out what they needed to say. And so that was a huge debacle. And they pulled their advertising from my station for a long time. A long time. And they used to spend a lot of money in this market with my station. So we learned a very painful lesson. And it's a lesson that when my news director recruits new employees, we sometimes tell them that story, new reporters, because we don't want them to make such a terrible mistake. And here's what the mistake really was taking a phone call and saying, oh, that's the story, and that's the whole story. Oh, I got the phone call. Yeah, I'll call Zaxby's, but they're kind of busy. So I'm just going to tell this story because this person called us. That doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean it's right. Just a failure at pretty much every level. So we use that. We instruct people on that all the time. And I make sure people know it because, and again, it's the manager's responsibility, but the reporters, they're new, they don't know. They've never gone through that. And it was quite an experience, something we still talk about. Yes?
A follow-up to when you call a client and give a client a heads up that
Yeah.
there's a story that's
Yeah.
going to run. So what if I'm the client and you call me and right then I say,
Yeah.
well, tell you what, Holly, I'm pulling my advertising
Yeah.
if you run with that story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So has that happened?
I don't think so. No one has actually said that, but
Maybe they weren't.
maybe they're
nasty as I
implying
sound
it. But
today.
yeah, I mean, that's always a risk. And I always say, well, let me check into it, make sure we have everything we need. Do you have anything to add to it? And if not, and if the story's good, I'll call back and say, we're going to go with it. We have to. It's a legitimate story, But again, I think everything has context. Like, is that, and it could well be the lead story, most important story of the day. Is it? Is it not? There's ways to tell it fairly, but still tell it. Because if that company has done something wrong, that's a story, no question. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
What's one of the most memorable stories you had to back up and correct the story? Was it the Zaxby story?
That's probably pretty much the biggest one I can think of. I'll tell you one that just happened where we didn't have to correct anything. We actually waited to tell the story, which is the Bubba Copeland story in the mayor of Smith Station, pastor in Phoenix City. We knew about that story several days before it broke in that 1819 news. And when it broke in 1819 news, some people were saying, we should do this story. And it's funny, my news director was actually busy on something, and the assistant asked me to join a news meeting, which we have a couple times a day, talk about stories. And I did, and I kept asking questions, like, well, what do we know about this? Like, how do we know it's true? I mean, all the things I was just talking about, essentially. And we called Bubba Copeland himself. My assistant news director knows him to the degree that she felt comfortable talking to him. And he said, if you report this, I don't know what I'll do. So she told me that, and the rest of us, and we talked about it. And I said, look, no story's worth someone doing something horrible, either to someone else or themselves. So we don't need to tell this story. We don't need to be first on this story. We just don't. Let's see what happens. So then the other couple stories, 18, 19 dropped, and then he talked to his congregation on Wednesday in a live stream where he directly talked about it, said he apologized if people were upset, but it wasn't going to change what he did. He still, believed he can do what he did. Called himself a victim of an internet attack. So we contacted the reporter that did that story at 1819 News and found out that he did an interview with us, and he recorded every single word that Bubba Copeland had said to him. And he never said, don't run this or something. I think he said something like, this is just private between us or my wife and me or that kind of stuff. So, I don't even, necessarily think it's a story at all, except when someone is a public figure and they do a couple different things. One of them is posting actual, words or pictures on the internet of actual people that don't know he's doing that, and that actually happened. So, that was kind of a big thing. We did a story yesterday where we interviewed 2 people whose pictures and names were used in some of the allegedly pornographic stories that he posted on the internet. And they were very unhappy that now their names and photos were on the internet and on these sites. And that's a legitimate thing, And also, it's a legitimate thing when, I hate to say it this way, but okay, suicides are not news, never, 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 unless they're a public official. So when Bubba Copeland committed suicide Friday night, that's a story that you're gonna have to cover anyway, right? So we only started covering the story on Friday when all this other stuff had already happened. And it was in the New York Post, it was in the Daily News, it was in the Daily Mail, it was all over the place. And yes, some of those are tabloid-ish, and they kind of focused on the whole issue of like outing him, which to me, that wasn't the issue. It was always like, well, what did he do when he was doing that? Did he violate the public trust or whatever? And we thought at the time we did the story that posting these pictures and doing potentially other things that were unknown, but some people knew about him, like the women that we interviewed yesterday, I felt it was legitimate to do a story. It wasn't a very long story at all. And I actually called our corporate legal counsel because I wanted to use a photo, but I didn't want to use the racy photos because I thought that was unnecessary. The photo I wanted to use was the one that started the whole thing, which is him in his wife's sweater or whatever. And the lawyer agreed with me that that makes it a story because, that's the reason that this whole thing came out, is that he posted those pictures on the internet under a false name and then admitted to it to these 1819 reporters. So probably not doing a great job explaining this because it's kind of, in a way, still happening, And so Friday night, when we all heard that he committed suicide, we were like devastated. And I went back to the station and talked to everyone who was there for a couple hours, and the reporter who did the story especially, telling him, look, here's what we did right. And personally, I don't think we did anything wrong. I might have a different opinion of 1819 News, maybe how they got that, I'm not sure. I think it was a disgruntled person, maybe it's a former employee or somebody. Someone had an axe to grind. But anyway, I told our staff, look, we talked about this. We delayed reporting on it responsibly because, like I said, you don't have to be first. It's not as important as it seems, We were measured about it. We listened to Mr. Copeland himself when he said, I don't know what I'd do. We were like, hey, nothing's worth that. And then as it proceeded and he appeared in public at the church, it was kind of obvious, well, I guess he's talking about it. He's out there. We used a soundbite of that. Everyone did. It was live streamed. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It does, and you brought something else up. You're getting some of our students who will eventually be in this industry.
Yeah.
What are some extra steps you're seeing that you might need to take with them? Say one of them wrote that story.
Yeah.
What are some challenges that you have to take to make sure, number one, they're ethical.
Yeah.
Because I am picking up a comm ethics class this semester, and I am grateful to them for opening my eyes to many things. But one of them might be that there's a changing definition of ethics.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately, you know, the journalists, you have a standard of ethics, a code of ethics, but sometimes you might be working with people who think that it's almost like flavor of the month with ethics.
Yeah.
So how do you mentor them into where they need to be? And then when they do a diligent job,
Yeah.
and maybe it goes awry like this story, then you try to pick up the pieces. What are some challenges on that?
Yeah. It's a really great question, because I think there's no question that there's a large segment of journalism that doesn't really have any ethics. They're going to just, you know, how can I get clicks and likes and retweets and all that? And their whole other topic someday worthy of discussion in one of your classes is probably how many people get their news from TikTok and Twitter, and it's scary. Okay.
That's what scared me.
Yeah.
And I'll not look
Because there are
more
no
to the right
ethics.
to identify the
Yeah.
class, but that is
Yeah.
scary to me.
And that's why you have to really consider the source, because it could be completely political. There could be another motivation going on. You never really know with those kind of sources. That's why, you know, everyone says, oh, traditional media is dying and all this. Not really, and luckily for us, that's not the case. But it's the case that we're strong locally is because we're the ones locally that are going to tell you if someone committed suicide who's a public figure, or if it's going to rain, or if it's going to be bad weather. We're the ones that are doing that. Twitter not going to tell you that the tornado is coming down Winton Boulevard or Winton Road, right? It's not. They don't care. All these other national entities don't care, and so they're much more liable to go with what sounds good, what fits a narrative, either way, whatever, pick a political persuasion, and there are people that'll fit the narrative and tweet out stuff that may not at all be true, you know, but they're saying it. So it's a very different kind of landscape right now, and trust in media has never been lower. Luckily, local news so far is hanging in there, but national media, no. I mean, people just don't trust it. They have about the same level of trust in media as Congress, and that's scary, because we know about Congress. But yeah, it's really difficult, and I don't think I would probably work at a place like 1819 News if they have the ethics to do. So when that first story came out, it was simply an outing, because at that time they didn't know any of this other stuff that he had posted. I think they alluded to he posted some fiction or something, but they didn't talk about this woman who was a real woman whose real name was used and the name of her business, and he said he fantasized about killing her and all this other stuff. So that wasn't happening. So at first it was kind of like an outing. That's not our job. I don't care who it is. We don't do that. We'll never do that. If someone came to me and said, you know, some public figure locally is, you know, trans or something, I don't care. I wouldn't. That's not a story. Only if they do something, you know, that's wrong, or they're using their public office to do something that they normally wouldn't be able to do, or something like that, you know. But yeah, it's difficult, because there are entities that'll publish just anything, you know. And it's scary, and it does undermine all of us eventually. And I really worry about social media. I don't do a lot of social media myself, and I counsel my employees all the time. Gray has a social media policy. If an employee posts something controversial, politically, any kind of controversy, right, they face termination. And I had to do it once. A really good guy on my staff posted something stupid about Kamala Harris, unnecessary, shouldn't have done it. If it was just his social media, it wouldn't be a thing at all. Unfortunately, he put WTVM next to his name because, of course, people like to do that if they work at the station. No, that wasn't good, because Gray saw it, and Gray asked the question that I think they have a right to ask, which is, why do we have a social media policy if we don't enforce it? So I had to fire that guy. There was no way out of that. And I use that all the time with new employees. I tell them that. I say, I had to fire someone once because they posted something stupid and wrong, and I don't want to have to do it to you. I'll tell them that. And about 5 or 6 times a year, I send out the social media policy from our handbook because I'm desperate to avoid anyone doing that. I don't want to have to fire someone. But, you know, I mean, I think it's appropriate that social media policies exist because there's just so much crap out there, you know, and it's just not good. So that was a long-winded answer to that question. But yeah, the Copeland story was quite interesting this week. It was
And how to
was
give
wild.
dignity when it's tough.
How what?
Dignity to the story.
Yeah,
And
right.
When it's tough.
Oh, and we had a reporter that first day when we knew about it, and we weren't going to report it that day anyway, because we had a meeting, we decided, we talked about it, which again, I say is the most important thing we did, was we talked about it, and we listened to people. And one of the people we listened to was the reporter who said, I don't feel comfortable doing this story. And again, this was early on. And I said, you know, he's got a point, and we have to respect that. And that went into our decision making. That decision early to not do anything, sometimes it's very easy to decide not to do anything. It sounds like it's easy, right? But it's definitely the path of least resistance. If you don't do anything, you can't get in trouble, right? But it wasn't because we didn't want to get in trouble. We didn't want to do the wrong thing. We didn't want to affect his life worse than it was being affected when we didn't even really know, like, what was the motivation behind this article. And I still think that there's another shoe that's going to drop, meaning other things are going to come out. It may be about 1819 and who gave them that story and why. That could be something that comes out. Could come out that he did other things that we don't even know about. So apparently he was telling friends right before he did, you know, commit suicide that he was really facing some darker days. So most of the stuff by that time that we knew about and that we still know about had come out, you know. So nothing has come out since then, but obviously he had a troubled life, and it was very, very sad that happened, you know. So any other questions or anything? Or any of you guys ever want to be a reporter or producer? You want to be a reporter? Great, great. Producing is a great job too. Sorry, I forgot to silence this before I came in. Producing's like reporting, only you're doing it for a whole newscast. You're writing a whole newscast, and you're deciding what stories are important, what story we should lead with, and maybe, you know, follow up on, have team coverage on a story if it's big enough, that kind of thing. Producers work with the directors to put the show, actually to put the newscast on the air in the way that it's supposed to go, with graphics and the right video. It's a great, I love producing. I thought it was one of the most creative jobs in the business. So look into that too if you're interested. A lot of people go from producing to being on air. And being on air is, these days, isn't just, you know, being on air. You got to shoot the story, got to write it, got to edit the video. It's a you know, one-man band kind of situation. So a lot has changed. You know, when I was a reporter, we had a photographer that worked with us every day, so we didn't have to shoot the video. We just had to do the interviews and write the story, and maybe go live at 6 if we had to. But it's very compressed now. Like, everything is done. This is why there can easily be a rush to judgment on the part of especially younger reporters, because they're feeling that deadline. Oh, I got to get it done. I only have, you know, this many hours to do it. And you know, that's a very real pressure, you know, that you have to fight as a reporter. You have to say, you have to be brave enough to tell the manager, this story's not ready yet. We're not ready, you know. And that's kind of essentially the decision we made with the Copeland story the first few days, you know. Yeah.
That's one of the things that I wanted to ask you, like, as a reporter, like, do you have to, like, just report the stories that the producer tells you to report? Do you have, like, a thing, anything that you report?
Every day we ask our reporters for story pitches. You know, what do they think is interesting? This, you know, assumes that they are in the know, that they're reading, you know, different news sources. both nationally and locally, because you want them to be well-rounded, and maybe there's a way to localize a national story. But yeah, we would ask you, what do you think would be a great story today? So yes, they don't have to just do what the producer says. Now, sometimes if they suggest a story and it just isn't coming together that day, we table it. We say, let's work on that tomorrow, but today I really need you to go cover this boring budget hearing at the city hall, right? Because we got to report on that. So that's the trade-off. Yes, you can give us great ideas, but we're not always going to be able to do those. But I love that it's an open process, and it really needs to be. It shouldn't be the managers just standing there going, yes, no, That's a good question. Well, thanks, you guys. Thanks for listening.